they say some families are cursed from birth, not by blood, but by silence. And in the dark valleys of West Virginia, where the hills swallow sound and the mist hides more than it reveals, there was a family that seemed born to suffer. Their home, a decaying farmhouse by the edge of Black Hollow Road, stood as a monument to everything the town wanted to forget. Locals said that if you passed by at night, you could still hear a baby crying inside, though the house had been empty for years. It began with the Whitlock family, a name that once meant respect, wealth, and influence. But power, when mixed with secrecy, has a way of turning rotten. The Whitlocks didn't just keep skeletons in their closets. They buried them, literally. And over the decades, the ground beneath their estate became a graveyard of sins, both remembered and erased. In the summer of 1912, the youngest Whitlock daughter, Mary Ellen, vanished. Her mother told neighbors she'd gone to live with distant relatives in Virginia. Her father, a proud man who ran the local ironworks, refused to speak her name again. The whispers, though, spread faster than smoke, that Mary Ellen had been with child, and that the child's father was no stranger to the family. When the sheriff came to question the patriarch, he found the man sitting on the porch, his hands raw and trembling, as though he'd been digging all night. He simply said, "Some things ain't meant for the living to know." The case went cold, and so did the hearts of everyone left behind. Years later, when the ironworks shut down and the Whitlocks fell into ruin, locals claimed to see figures moving through the overgrown yard, shapes too tall, too twisted to be human. The family line dwindled, and those who survived either drank themselves to death or disappeared entirely. But one name would surface again and again, carved into forgotten ledgers and half-burned letters: the child of darkness. What was born that summer wasn't just a child, it was a curse, one that would ripple through generations like a disease that no doctor could ever cure, and by the time anyone realized the truth, it was already too late. The Whitlocks weren't just haunted, they were consumed. By the time the 1930s rolled in, the Whitlock estate was more ruin than home. The windows were boarded up, the roof sagged like a broken spine, and what remained of the family lived in near isolation. The surviving son, Thomas Whitlock, was said to be a man both brilliant and broken, a scholar obsessed with ancestry, whose nights were spent poring over old journals by candlelight, and whose days were spent digging in the woods behind the house. Neighbors would see him out there, his shirt soaked with sweat, his hands caked in mud, muttering to himself as he unearthed small boxes wrapped in oilcloth. No one dared ask what he was looking for. Some said he was searching for his lost sister's remains. Others said he was hunting for something she left behind, something not meant for human eyes. Inside the decaying home, Thomas kept a diary, one that wouldn't surface until decades later, found sealed inside a rotted dresser drawer. In it, he wrote of hearing footsteps in the attic, though he lived alone. He described voices calling his name at night, soft and pleading, followed by the smell of burning iron. He believed the Whitlock curse was no myth, that it was a living thing, passed through blood like an infection of the soul. One entry stood out: "She comes to me now, not as a ghost, but as a shadow. She whispers that the child still breathes, that it never died, that it waits in the earth for me to dig deep enough." Within weeks of that final entry, Thomas vanished. No body, no sign of struggle. Just a shovel left sticking out of the ground near a pit he'd been digging. A pit that seemed far too deep for any single man to have dug alone. When the sheriff came to investigate, he found something strange buried near the hole. A small porcelain doll, its face cracked and blackened with age. Sewn into its dress was a name: Mary Ellen. The sheriff ordered the pit filled, the property condemned. But the earth doesn't forget, and over the years, anyone who trespassed onto that land, hunters, teenagers, even drifters, reported the same thing. That same crying sound, drifting up from beneath the ground, like something buried alive, was still trying to breathe. In the years that followed, The Whitlock name became a whisper, a cautionary tale told to children who wandered too far into the woods. The land where their home once stood was overgrown. The house collapsed into itself like a dying lung. But the story didn't die. It lingered, in court records, in rumor, in the uneasy silence of those who'd seen too much. Then, in 1964, a new family bought the property, unaware of what had happened there. The Harlans were city folk from Ohio, eager to start fresh, far from the noise of industry and the stench of steel. They saw the ruined farmhouse not as cursed, but as a challenge, something to be rebuilt, reclaimed, reborn. But the land it remembers. On their first night in the house, their young son, Peter, woke screaming. He told his parents a lady had stood at the end of his bed, her hair dripping wet, her face pale as snow, whispering, "Don't wake the child." His parents chalked it up to imagination, until the next morning, when muddy footprints led from the boy's room all the way out to the yard. Over the next few months, the Harlans would experience what the locals had warned them about. Tools vanishing, walls bleeding moisture that smelled like rusted metal, and a constant, low hum under the floorboards that seemed to vibrate through the whole house. They even found old letters sealed behind the fireplace bricks. Letters written by Thomas Whitlock himself, begging whoever read them to leave what lies beneath undisturbed. The Harlans ignored the warnings. Curiosity is a dangerous thing. When they began renovations, the crew unearthed a series of strange tunnels under the property, hand-dug, narrow, filled with old jars containing locks of hair, teeth, and bits of fabric that looked centuries old. The sheriff ordered the site shut down immediately, but by then, the damage was done. The Harlans' youngest daughter stopped speaking. She just sat by the window each day, humming an old lullaby no one had ever taught her. 3 months later, the Harlans packed up and left. They didn't even try to sell the land. Locals say the house sighed that night, a deep, exhaling groan, as if it were alive, relieved to be left alone again. But curses don't sleep forever. And this one was about to wake again, through blood it didn't yet know it had. By the late 1970s, the Whitlock property had become a ghost story in its own right, a place nobody dared approach after dusk. Yet even in absence, the family's shadow lingered. Researchers and thrill-seekers occasionally trespassed, drawn by curiosity or disbelief, only to return shaken, their eyes haunted, their voices trembling. They spoke of whispers carried by the wind, of shapes glimpsed between broken trees, and of a cold presence that followed them long after they left. It was during this time that a man named Samuel Whitlock appeared, a distant relative who had spent decades in California, unaware of the horrors embedded in his lineage. He inherited what remained of the family fortune, the land, the collapsed house, and the secrets buried beneath it. Samuel was skeptical at first. Ghosts, curses, childhood superstitions. These were not for a modern man. He saw the property as nothing more than a potential investment, a forgotten relic of Appalachia. But the moment he set foot on the land, something inside him shifted. He felt an odd familiarity with the soil, the stones, the decaying timber. It was as if the land recognized him, welcomed him, and whispered secrets in a language only his blood could understand. Samuel began exploring the ruins, cataloging the remnants of the Whitlock lives. Journals, letters, photographs, even small personal effects hidden in nooks of the house, and in the deepest corner of the cellar, beneath a collapsed floorboard, he found a box unlike any he had ever seen. Inside were brittle letters, yellowed photographs, and a small, twisted bundle of cloth. Unwrapping it revealed a doll, nearly identical to the one Thomas had unearthed decades earlier. Soon into it a small note, barely legible. The blood remembers. Over the following nights, Samuel experienced dreams that were not his own. He saw the farmhouse as it once was, filled with laughter, screams, and the faintest smell of iron. He witnessed events he could not have known, a young girl being hidden in a cellar, a man digging in the woods, and a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching and waiting. The more he learned, the more the threads of the family's darkness wove into his own mind. Samuel tried to leave. He tried to sell the land, to walk away, to ignore what was happening. But something held him there, a pull deeper than fear, stronger than reason. The Whitlock blood, it seemed, demanded recognition, and the closer Samuel got to uncovering the full truth, the more the past seemed to creep into the present, until he realized that some secrets are never truly buried. By the early 1980s, the story of the Whitlock property had begun to spread beyond West Virginia. Paranormal investigators, journalists, and curious outsiders came, hoping to glimpse the unknown, or to capture evidence of what the locals insisted was real. But almost every visitor left shaken, sometimes violently so. Equipment malfunctioned, cameras broke, and those who stayed the night reported seeing figures moving in corners, shadows that bent in unnatural ways, and a persistent, low moan that seemed to seep from the very ground. Samuel, by now, had begun documenting everything. He filmed the interior of the ruins, photographed strange markings carved into walls, and recorded audio. Hours of whispers, laughter, and crying that no human could have produced. Yet even with this evidence, he remained haunted. Every night, he dreamt of Mary Ellen, or what he called the child of darkness. In his dreams, she was not innocent. She was something else, older than her years, knowing, patient and cruel. She beckoned him to follow her into the woods, where shadows twisted like branches reaching for the living. One night in the middle of February, Samuel awoke to the sound of scratching, a rhythmical tapping under his floorboards. At first, he thought it was rats, or perhaps the cold contracting the wood. But the sound grew louder, insistent, and accompanied by a whisper. "You're too late. You've come too far." He found himself unable to resist, compelled to descend into the cellar, into the darkness that had swallowed so many of his ancestors. And it was there that Samuel found the first living proof of what the Whitlocks had been hiding, a hidden tunnel beneath the cellar floor, walls lined with small alcoves. In each alcove rested objects of strange familiarity, more dolls, shards of porcelain, and letters detailing things he was certain could not be real. Names, dates, and events spanning a century, all connected by a single thread, a lineage of secrecy, betrayal, and an obsession with purity of blood. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments. What would you have done if this was your bloodline? The tunnel ended in a chamber, dimly lit by a single, cracked window. And in that chamber was something Samuel would never forget: a small cot, a bundle of clothing, and a diary that chronicled the unspeakable truth of the Whitlocks' darkest secret. A truth that not even time could erase. The diary Samuel found belonged to Mary Ellen, or at least, to someone claiming to be her. The entries were unsettling in ways that words often fail to capture. She wrote of a childhood stolen by fear, of whispers in the night telling her that she was special, chosen to carry on the family's legacy. Her tone shifted as the pages progressed: innocence giving way to obsession, love twisting into cruelty, and eventually, a chilling sense of purpose. She wrote of her child, hidden away from the world, born under circumstances the local authorities would never understand. Mary Ellen detailed the measures she took to ensure the child's survival: secret names, hidden paths, and a lineage of manipulation designed to protect the child from discovery. But woven through her meticulous notes was a growing madness, a conviction that the Whitlock bloodline was both a gift and a curse. Samuel read on, heart-pounding, as Mary Ellen described the child's development. Strange behaviors, impossible feats for a child, a gaze that unnerved even her parents. The diary described rituals and ceremonies, small acts intended to guide the child, acts that modern readers would recognize as deeply disturbing. Yet Mary Ellen seemed to believe she was doing what any parent would: protecting her family, preserving the bloodline, honoring a legacy that had been kept secret for generations. But the diary also revealed something else, something far more sinister. Mary Ellen wrote of others, Outsiders who came too close, family members who questioned her actions, anyone who threatened the secret. Each encounter ended in silence, each threat removed by means that were never fully explained, though hints of violence lingered in her words. As Samuel turned the pages, a strange feeling settled over him, a creeping certainty that the child, the one referred to as the child of darkness, was not just a myth. The final entry suggested that the child had grown, that it had learned the family's lessons, and that it now waited in the shadows for the next generation to awaken the legacy. Samuel closed the diary, trembling. The house around him seemed to groan, as if aware of the secrets now fully uncovered. And for the first time, he understood the weight of the Whitlock curse. It was not just a story, not just a rumor. It was alive, patient, and waiting to continue its work, generation after generation. After reading the diary, Samuel felt as though the air itself had grown heavier. Every corner of the ruined farmhouse seemed to pulse with memory. The echo of past lives, the whispers of those who had suffered, and the unrelenting presence of something older, something that had watched his family for decades. He realized that the Whitlocks were not merely haunted by tragedy, they were instruments of it, bound by a pattern of secrecy, betrayal, and obsession that no one could easily escape. Over the following weeks, Samuel explored the surrounding woods, compelled to trace the footsteps of those who had come before him. He found depressions in the soil where graves had been hastily dug, fragments of old toys, and rusted tools partially buried in mud. Each discovery hinted at a carefully orchestrated lineage of concealment. A family determined to shield its sins from the world, yet unable to shield itself from their consequences. Samuel also uncovered letters from the Harlan family, long lost to local archives. They described inexplicable phenomena, doors opening on their own, strange shadows moving along the walls, a sense that someone, or something, was observing them constantly. These letters, combined with Mary Ellen's diary, painted a picture of a curse that was not confined to blood alone, but tied to the land itself. Whoever crossed its threshold was subject to its memory, its rules, and its judgment. The realization settled in slowly, but with unshakable gravity. The Whitlocks' horror was cyclical. Each generation repeated the sins of the last, whether through deliberate action or the invisible pressures of the family's legacy. And the child of darkness, now an adult, was living proof that secrets, once born into the world, refused to remain silent. Samuel became obsessed with uncovering the child's identity, desperate to know whether it was still among the living, whether it carried the same intensity of purpose as Mary Ellen had described. He spoke with old-timers in the nearby town, visited cemeteries, and examined census records. What he discovered was unnerving births and deaths that never quite aligned, children who vanished and reappeared, adults who seemed to age differently, and a shadowy network of people bound together by lineage and secrecy. It was becoming impossible to separate myth from reality. The more Samuel learned, the more he understood that the Whitlocks' history was not one of isolated events, but a carefully constructed maze of horror, designed to trap anyone who dared to seek the truth. And the deeper he went, the more he realized that he had become part of the story, the latest participant in a cycle that had been repeating for over a century. By the late 1980s, Samuel had become a recluse, obsessed with documenting every aspect of the Whitlock legacy. He filled notebooks with names, dates, and locations, cross-referencing each discovery with letters, diaries, and town records. But the more he uncovered, the more he felt the eyes of the past upon him. It was as if the land itself had a memory, a consciousness that watched, waited, and judged every step he took. One night, while examining an old photograph of Mary Ellen, Samuel noticed something that had eluded him before: a shadowy figure standing behind her, face obscured but unmistakably human. It was small, childlike, yet there was an air of intelligence, a knowing presence that made his skin crawl. He realized, with a chill that turned his blood to ice, that this was the child she had spoken of, the one who had inherited not only her bloodline but her obsession. Determined to understand the scope of the curse, Samuel began interviewing townspeople whose families had interacted with the Whitlocks over the decades. Some were reluctant to speak, others refused entirely. But fragments emerged, stories of neighbors who suddenly vanished, of children who displayed unnerving behavior, of whispers in the night warning of dangers unseen. Each account pointed toward a single truth. The Whitlocks had not merely been unlucky. They had been chosen by something older, darker, and more enduring than any human malice. Samuel also began experiencing strange phenomena in his own home. He would wake to find objects moved, photographs altered, and the unmistakable scent of iron drifting through the air. At times, he felt a presence standing at the foot of his bed, watching silently invisible yet undeniably there. Sleep became impossible. Food lost its taste. Time itself seemed to warp around him, as if he were being pulled into a narrative that had started long before his birth. And yet, despite all warnings, he could not stop. There was a compulsion embedded deep within him, a thread of blood memory passed down through generations, guiding him toward the ultimate revelation. Samuel was no longer merely a historian or an observer. He had become a participant in the Whitlocks' ongoing story, subject to the same forces of secrecy, betrayal, and shadowed destiny that had haunted his ancestors. By the early 1990s, Samuel had pieced together the most disturbing revelation of all. The child of darkness had never been fully isolated. The bloodline had survived, spreading quietly through the region, unnoticed but potent. It had learned to hide in plain sight, infiltrating towns, workplaces, and families, always observing, always calculating. Those who had brushed against it often vanished, moved away, or lived in quiet despair, their lives subtly reshaped by forces they could not comprehend. Samuel realized that Mary Ellen's child, now grown, was not just an individual, but a manifestation of the family's collective obsession with control, secrecy, and survival. This entity, human yet something beyond, had inherited centuries of knowledge, cunning, and the eerie ability to manipulate those around it without detection. Every act of cruelty, every hidden betrayal recorded in the family's history seemed to converge in this one being, perfectly designed to perpetuate the Whitlock legacy. As he delved deeper, Samuel noticed the pattern. The child of darkness appeared whenever the family's secrets were threatened with exposure. Births, disappearances, and unexplained deaths across generations now made sense. They were not random tragedies. They were instruments of preservation, mechanisms of survival honed over a century. The very land seemed to respond to the presence of this bloodline, its soil and ruins absorbing the echoes of past horrors, holding them in readiness until they were called forth again. One evening, Samuel returned to the ruins of the farmhouse, drawn by a force he could neither name nor resist. He walked the overgrown path to the cellar, flashlight in hand, and descended into the cold, damp tunnels beneath the house. There, he found signs that someone, or something, had been living in the shadows, footprints in the mud, remnants of food, and a series of small alcoves with objects eerily similar to those Mary Ellen had catalogued decades earlier. In the dim light, he realized with mounting dread that the child of darkness was no longer a legend or a diary entry. It was real, and it had been waiting. Every choice Samuel had made, every step he had taken, had been anticipated. And now, standing in the echoing silence of the tunnels, he understood the final truth: some legacies are never meant to be unraveled, and some curses are not meant to be confronted, only survived. Samuel never fully escaped the Whitlock legacy. In the years that followed, he documented everything he could, leaving behind journals, photographs, and recordings that now serve as the last testament of a family consumed by its own darkness. But even as he wrote, even as he tried to warn the world, he knew he had become part of the curse. The child of darkness, now fully realized, continued its existence somewhere in the folds of the Appalachian hills, watching, waiting, and ensuring that the cycle would never end. Locals still speak of the Whitlock land in hushed tones, warning outsiders not to tread there after dusk. They whisper of a figure glimpsed between the trees, tall, silent, and impossibly still. They say that on quiet nights, the wind carries the faintest cry of a child. Not sorrowful, not pleading, but knowing, aware, and patient. And sometimes, those who ignore the warnings vanish. They are never seen again, their stories absorbed into the endless, dark chronicle of the Whitlocks. The legacy of the family is not merely one of tragedy or madness. It is a warning. Secrets, when nurtured over generations, can become entities in themselves, capable of shaping reality and bending the living to their will. Bloodlines, obsessions, and betrayal are not just personal matters. They are forces that ripple outward, touching everything in their path. And when these forces converge, they create something that is not meant to be understood, only acknowledged. As for Samuel, he left the ruins, but the land never let him go entirely. He would wake in the night to whispers, catch shadows at the edge of his vision, and smell the faint scent of iron on the wind. He knew, as we now know, that the story of the Whitlocks is not over. It never will be. It endures in hidden corners, in quiet whispers, and in the blood that refuses to die. And so, the final lesson remains: some families are not simply born into history. They are born into darkness. And when you step into their shadows, you become part of a story far older, far darker, and far more unrelenting than anything the world outside could ever imagine. The Whitlocks are waiting, patient as always, and the child of darkness will always be there, at the edge of vision, reminding us that some truths are too heavy to carry, yet impossible to ignore.